Well, thanks so much, Lance, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the first of our four-part series of really supercharging the middle mile for rural America. And I'm joined today with Terry Chevalier from Sunstone Associates, and together we're going to be kind of talking about some of the key trends that we see in the market that's driving traffic in the rural market, and how's that impacting on your network. So lots of interesting insights we're going to deliver to you, and Terry and I are actually going to kind of go back and forth on some of these topics. So as we said, this is the first in a four-part series. So lots of exciting things to walk you through, and these will be every 2 weeks. So the next one will be on August 6th. And just to give you kind of a highlight, what we're going to walk through in the webinar series. Today, we're talking more about the trends in the market, what's driving the market in the middle mile. The second, we'll actually get into, well, what is that architecture to build out to satisfy those trends that you're going to see today. The third one, we'll actually talk about management and automation, which is really a key thing for many of our customers, many of the network operators out there. These networks have become much more complex, more services, and so really everyone's looking for ways to make it easier to manage and especially to automate. And then finally, Terry and I are going to come back with really a question we get from many customers is, well, okay, lots of trends in the market. We built this wonderful network and know how to manage and automate it. Well, how do I monetize it, right? These networks have a tremendous capacity, and many customers kind of ask the question, help us monetize that. What services can I offer? What are some of the lessons learned from other service providers out there? And we'll cover that in the fourth session. So thank you for joining us today, and we hope you'll continue to attend through the whole series. So let's kick it off, and so I'm going to kind of kick it off with some kind of high-level trends, and then I'm going to turn it over to Terry, and he's going to kind of deep dive on some of the areas. So the first thing I want to talk about, what's driving the middle mile from a traffic perspective, and one kind of an interesting report, you should check it out. We can send the link to it. It's a company called AppLogic Network. They used to be called Sandvine Networks. They sell deep packet inspection equipment, and they have the ability to see what are all the applications kind of being used in the network. And they publish a report twice a year, one for fixed and one for mobile, and giving kind of the results of that. And they kind of embed their equipment in some of their top customers, and they come back with some very interesting reports. And so one of the trends, and I'm sure there's no surprise out here, is that streaming video is really probably one of the biggest contributors to what's driving traffic in the network. Very much, if you've heard the term cord cutter, which is basically people who used to have a cable, like a full broadcast cable TV service, and they've cut the cord and now moved to a streaming model. And we all tend to think of that as, oh, I'm going to watch Netflix, which are pre-recorded shows, but we're starting to see a lot more real-time streaming video as well. So on the left, you can see some of the top contributors, the top applications. What, interesting enough, one of the top ones, which kind of really surprised me, is YouTube. And YouTube is a totally different model than say Netflix. YouTube, the content basically is created by the users who post it. So this is interesting. YouTube kind of took off during COVID when everyone was kind of like stuck at home and couldn't bring in a repair person. They had to go online to, how do I repair my vacuum cleaner type of thing. We were all stuck and nobody could come repair stuff, right? But YouTube, it's amazing. Read an article recently. In terms of minutes consumed, actually is the leading video streamer out there. Obviously, the ones we all know, Netflix was, dominated for so many years and continues to dominate. Folks like Amazon Prime, Disney, and on and on. I'll show that on the next chart. Another interesting trend, and one other thing I kind of shared as an insight is an event like the Super Bowl tends to be, think of it as the new Mother's Day. Those of us who have been in this business long enough know we used to engineer voice networks for Mother's Day, right? Because that was the day everyone phoned mom. The networks were kind of stressed. Today, we tend to think of an event like the Super Bowl as being a top streaming event. When you've got 100 million plus people viewing it, a lot of them are streaming it. But it's interesting, we're starting to see emergence of events that are just for streaming. So the Super Bowl, obviously, you can still get it via ESPN, broadcast TV. Not everybody streams the Super Bowl. But now we're starting to see a lot of football games that are only available via streaming. So such as Prime Video signed some deals like that, Netflix, and so on. So that's basically, if you want to see that football game, you've got to go stream. And so it's interesting. I was talking to some customers who are basically starting to see that it's these football games that are just unique to streaming are becoming these kind of top, streaming, stressing my network kind of events. And we're probably going to see more and more of these as these companies are now, trying to sign contracts with the NFL and so on to get that on their platform. So some interesting thing, and it'd be interesting to see kind of what you see out there.
Hey, Mitch, just if I can add on that, I think that's a great point. And a lot of the rural operators that I work with, we started talking about the Thursday night football effect, in their eyes, they start nodding because yes, my network's getting crushed. But I was looking this up because I don't know about you. I was trying to watch the Jake Paul, Mike Tyson fight like everybody else. Mm-hmm. And obviously Netflix had their issues, but here's what I found fascinating. That event had 65 million concurrent streams going on at the same time. But here's the interesting thing. In the fourth quarter, Netflix signed up 18.9 million new subscribers, which was twice what they had forecast simply because of having these events. Mm-hmm. They actually signed up 1.43 million just within 3 days of the event. So to your point, there is a big business case for live streaming events. And so we are absolutely going to see more and more of this. It's not going to be just football. It's going to be all kinds of things.
Absolutely. I agree. And that's why, we're going to, as we talked through today, customers have to get their middle miles ready to
absolutely
support those companies. These are the peak events where you absolutely have to have that best performance. Mm-hmm. Back to streaming video, another interesting thing, just to kind of go further to that, is the fact that it's not just a streaming video, but it's actually 4K content is becoming more prevalent. So a lot of this, and I've kind of listed here all the top different, streaming video providers. So it's not just the live sports, but people watching, pre-recorded content, and it's in 4K. And 4K tends to be the highest, bandwidth consumer, pretty much of anything. And so you can see here the recommendations, whether Netflix is recommending a 15 megabit, stream for that. Disney is 25 meg, and the same for Apple TV Plus. And pretty much on many of these platforms, if you have a 4K capable TV, of which it's becoming very common now, pretty much any new TV you're going to buy today is 4K ready. And you stream these services, you're going to get it in 4K, and you're going to be needing these streams. And so all it takes is a couple of 4K TVs. And I know in my house, I've got, my daughter home, and she's streaming something. My son's he's on YouTube all day long. And it doesn't take a lot to really push the edges in terms of requiring bandwidth. So more and more, as much as all the other stuff is a contributor, obviously the live sports is important, but 4K is really probably the biggest contributor, and we're going to continue to see more and more. Pretty much any content that's being made today is 4K ready. So basically, for our customers, when you're building a network, when you're building the middle mile, it has to be ready for these different services, right? And every different kind of service is going to require, different performance. So again, we talked about kind of the internet entertainment, high bandwidth. I mean, here, again, we all want to avoid that spinning wheel of death, right? The buffering message that you get. And I think you mentioned Netflix is still figuring out how to overcome that, right? That's the thing. Unfortunately, for many customers, end user basically blames their service provider versus the content provider, even though in a lot of cases it's the content provider that's causing the issue. So things like doing gaming, low latency is critical. You want to do distance learning, which actually is becoming very common now after COVID, and the same with telehealth is more and more after COVID that became basically now a new option, and even post COVID now people are taking many appointments now via telehealth and avoiding traffic on the road. So the key is you have to engineer your network to be able to support these different service types and have the network. And that's why we'll talk a little bit later, a service aware network, a network that's able to differentiate between these different services is key.
Yeah, Mitch, if I could just on that, I mean, I think I love the point over subscription, because let's be honest, I mean, that is one of the critical ways that we are able to monetize our network. I mean, we basically have a set amount of capacity when we are going to basically oversell that relative to that capacity. But as you're saying, I think more and more people are starting to run up against, there are all these unique services that are beginning to, challenge that model. If you're going to be able to sustain that kind of monetization, you need something that's going to be able to support that going forward. So I think it's a really good point. And it's obviously the complexity is just getting really crazy for the network managers.
Exactly. I think the challenge is if you have a lot of video traffic, it can overwhelm these other traffic types, right? So again, if you have gamers, you don't want to, and it's during one of these football events, you want to make sure that their performance is maintained. And I know I've started to see some service providers actually creating gaming specific services with that ultra low latency guarantee. So it's interesting. We kind of always talked about it, but I'm starting to see some service providers do that. Yeah. So again, we're going to talk a lot more about the middle mile, but I thought this is interesting from a perspective of many times. And again, I've been in this business many years. I've seen how the bandwidth has grown over the years for these different services. Traditionally for broadband, 100 gig was kind of viewed as sufficient. A lot of people said, "Oh, I'll put 100 gig in, and that'll last me forever." And the reality is, with some of these new services and service growth, I'll show you an example of, is that really enough, right? So here's an example on the left. This is a kind of tier 3 telco in Georgia. They had traditionally 3 broadband tiers where it was 1 gig was kind of the maximum. And they were basically running at about 75% of 100 gig capacity. So they were kind of running up against their limit as we speak. And then they kind of did an interesting experiment. They kind of said, well, I want to really, I want to open the door to see how do I keep my competitors out? How do I really kind of change the game for broadband? And they did an experiment, and they went and they upgraded many of their kind of 300 meg, 500 meg subscribers to 1 gig. And they wanted to see the impact on their network. They wanted to reset their broadband benchmark as 1 gig and up, which we're starting to see a lot more of. And the interesting thing in this experiment, they basically recognized that their 100 gig middle mile would not be enough to support that. So if they wanted to do this service change, they had to upgrade, and they're now in the process of upgrading to 400 gig everywhere. And recognize as well, they're not saying they need a full 400 gig. The reality is the way the economics of Ethernet are such that the minute you get beyond 100 gig or even towards 200 gig, the economics to go to 400 gig are just a no-brainer, right? It's just, you're going to get all that extra bandwidth for free. So certainly something, you have to really kind of look at your traffic capacity today and see if you wanted to do something like this in the future, you really do have to make sure your middle mile is scalable. And finally, kind of, and we'll touch on this later, kind of the interesting applications in the rural market. And so this again, and over the years, I've spoken to many different service providers in rural America, kind of seeing their applications. And so you have to, again, look at not just the residential market, but the business market. And so things like you're starting to see smart factories in your territory. Those folks need, again, specific bandwidth services. Agriculture, smart ag is something I've heard from many customers. I remember talking to a customer in Alabama, putting sensors in poultry farms, and they're using this to basically look at the temperature and the humidity, and they're, using this to ensure they're not having any issues going on to maximize their livestock yields. We had another customer in Pennsylvania that had a lot of maple syrup farms, and they were again putting sensors on that to see when is the perfect time to kind of tap that maple syrup. So a lot of interesting smart ag kind of applications. Certainly education, again, that's continued to be prevalent as people are doing a lot more online training. And then obviously we talked about we talked about residential, and we're starting to see some unique kind of gaming services. So that's kind of my intro. I'm going to turn it now over to Terry. He's going to kind of walk through some specific kind of market insights. I'm going to come back at the back end, and we'll talk about something that's very top of mind, is about AI, which I think is a really good opportunity in the rural market. So I'm going to over to you, Terry.
All right. Well, thanks, Mitch. I appreciate it. And thanks, everybody. Appreciate you joining us today. As everybody mentioned, I am Terry Chevalier. I'm founder and managing director of Sunsnow Associates. And so what we do at Sunsnow is we help rural operators to grow and scale. And we do that by shaping strategy and aligning the team around a common, set of goals. And everything that we do is driven by data. Everything is done based upon what we're seeing in the marketplace and what's applicable to that set of customers. So I'm very grateful to Ribbon for this opportunity. We're going to move through this, and this will be a conversation. So Mitch, chime in kind of your perspective, and I think that'll be really helpful for folks. But I'm just going to go through some high level trends. And what I will also highlight too is just think about the trends I'm going to talk about probably touch a lot of parts of your business. I am going to focus a lot on sort of the implications on the middle mile, because that's a critical element as you have an ability to respond. This first piece, this is not really a trend. You guys may have remembered this if you've taken a business class or an economics class. I mean, this is essentially an adoption curve. And every service, and I just want to remind everybody, every service goes through a cycle. So it goes from introduction to a level of growth as we're learning more about the service, we're adding features and capabilities, it reaches a level of maturity, and then we start to see decline as the next thing starts coming along. And what's important to understand as you look at this is we have a whole host of access technologies that we have to manage across our network. We still have traditional voice, even though it's arguably in decline. In fact, I remember the days when we were trying to manage the rate of decline in our access line base, because if you were doing really well, you didn't have a really big decline number. We have AI on the other side, and so everybody's starting to see AI. We're seeing AI impacts on the network. We're starting to see that, but it doesn't stop there. We've got things like mobile networks that we connect to, because at the end of the day, everything's got to get in the ground. So whether it's a 4G connection or a 5G connection, we've got 5G fixed wireless access that's coming up. But it also extends to other services. From maybe you have a 10 gig DIA circuit. Some people are really pushing to 100 gig right now. We're seeing 400 gig data center needs coming up. So the whole point is you operate in a very dynamic environment. And so the implication for your middle mile is your middle mile's got to be flexible. It's got to be able to support all of these different things, because what you want to do is make sure that your investment is able to support as many different services and revenue streams as possible in the most efficient way possible. So that's just kind of a little bit of a context, not as much of a trend, but sort of an important point to keep in mind as we go through this. And if we can go to the next slide, Mitch. All right. So the first thing, let's get them out of the way, grants. We are coming off what I'm calling a grant wave. So if you go back in time and you look from 2010 to 2020, and you look at sort of what was the quote grant-like programs that were out there, and I'm not including universal service because that's been fairly consistent across that time for high cost fund. I know I've got CAF in there. But if I take the NTIA BTOP program, I take the Reconnect 1 and 2, which were sort of the latter half of the decade, and CAF 2 auction. I mean, we're talking about $8 billion. So less than $1 billion a year was invested by the government in networks. In the last 4 years, and note, I don't include BEAD in that because that's coming up. If you just look at things like SLURF, ARPA funds, capital projects funds, all the FCC programs, Affordable Connectivity Program, Emergency Connectivity Fund, you basically had 7 times the amount of funding in 4 years. So it's almost $14 billion a year going in. Now, we've got BEAD coming, and frankly, a lot of the states are either in their benefit of the bargain round, we'll talk about this in a second, or they're going to be completing soon. But that's going to happen quick. So the way that we've had to operate is going back to the norm as we go through that. But here's what's really important. This money went to areas that, frankly, could not support themselves. They did not have a business case to build to them. Most of this money is CapEx. It's not OpEx. So you've got to have a network and an operation that allows you to sustain those areas and be able to provide that. Your middle mile is an essential part of that conversation. How do you deliver that? How do you deliver it efficiently and cost effectively? It is part of that whole point. So that's sort of the point. And I want people to remember is like what we've dealt with the last 4 years is not what it's going to look like as we go forward. And Mitch, I don't know if you guys are seeing anything as well from Ribbon. I know you get a lot of questions about, BEAD and all this other stuff too.
I mean, I know it's interesting how to me, the middle channel is kind of surprising because everyone's been so focused on BEAD, but the fact is there was a lot of money distributed, through the states, through other sources, that are not necessarily BEAD. And so, that's the good news is that, there was a lot of money being distributed. Obviously, lots of customers are self-funding as well. So that's the good news for, a lot of broadband investment being made. And like I said, I know you're going to talk about a lot of questions of kind of how the rules have changed
Right.
now with the new administration for BEAD. So how's that all going to shake out? So I know you're going to talk about that in the next few charts.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'll take care of that. So, all right. I have to cover a little bit of competition in LEO because it comes up in every conversation. So if the past few years, every time I talk to somebody, it's about grants. Now it seems to be about BEAD and LEO. In fact, if you click the little quick button, what we'll see here is I think the number one thing that people are wanting to understand is Mr. Musk's role in all this. When we started the administration, there was a lot of concern about how close that relationship was. Obviously, with things that have happened in the past 45 to 60 days, now it's a little bit up in the air. But I think this is really interesting. And I found this data from futuretimeline.net. And that was really, it was really interesting. And so what they did is a study. This is actually cost, to put a kilogram up in low Earth orbit. Going back from the 80s, the days of the space shuttle, what I remember, the space program being to, by 2020, when you look at the Falcon Heavy rocket, what it's capable of doing, and you see that we basically driven down roughly 90 times the cost to launch a kilogram into low Earth orbit. At the same time, if you equate that to a 20-year compound annual decline, it's 25%. I mean, that's a massive amount on an annualized basis to reduce. So it's really phenomenal. But then you have to step back and say, so why are they doing this? The whole goal of Elon Musk is to make human beings a multiplanetary species. We're thinking in terms of broadband. We're thinking about broadband business. He's on a whole different plane of where we're thinking. So we have to keep that in mind when we're thinking about competition as it's coming. And we'll talk briefly about that. The other big issue with Leo that people are starting to talk about is Amazon and Project Kuiper, because I think that if Elon Musk's goal is really about, I need to generate the revenues, I need to support the mission to Mars, we have an example with Amazon that has disrupted many different industries, but they focus on that customer experience. So the one, I will say, the one Achilles heel of low Earth orbit is latency, because it's physics, right? Light can only travel so fast based on so far. Frankly, that's why Elon Musk has been trying to get into very low Earth orbit satellite systems for past several years. But even with that, this again reinforces why you need to have good latency and service capabilities in your network, because that helps you differentiate across a range of different issues as you go forward. Hey, Mitch, I think you might
totally different than Elon's, because he could just basically say, hey, a new benefit of having Amazon Prime is I'll give you free broadband, right? So it could be that could be a game changer. It'd be interesting to see where that goes.
Absolutely. Yep, there they are. There's Mr. Musk. There's Mr. Bezos as they come. Yeah. Well, let's keep on going. So the other one is 5G fixed wireless. So if you look in the trade press, everybody talks about how much fixed wireless is growing. And the reality is everybody who's been in this industry knows fixed wireless has been around for a long time. In fact, many rural providers, whether they be ILECs, co-ops, whatever, they're using some fixed wireless in some locations. But that traditional fixed wireless model has been, I've got a tower, I've got to do a truck roll, I've got to install equipment, bore side it back to the tower. That's been the model. So it's a very expensive model. 5G based fixed wireless, completely different. I'm using the cell tower that's existing there. I basically drop ship equipment to somebody. They plug it in, it's up and running. And as this data was showing, and I found this from Fitch Ratings in one of their reports, it shows that where this has really made an impact is against cable and legacy businesses. And why is that? Because it's really lower speed. It's good reliability. It's not great reliability, but it's good enough. It's a low cost. It's the definition of disruptive. But what you have to also think about is, especially for rural providers, where is most of the quote fallow spectrum that a mobile operator has? It's in rural areas, because they deploy into urban areas where there's a huge amount of traffic and people. They have to put huge amounts of capacity. But when they buy these licenses, they cover huge territories. So they've got all this extra spectrum that's sitting over rural areas. The thing here is, while this could be a competitive, these capabilities really only compete with what I call more of a very value-minded customer who really wants lower speeds, is happy with lower speeds. It'll get better over time, but it won't compete with fiber in that sense. But all of these sites still have to be connected. And this is where your middle mile comes into play. Because if you have a strong middle mile, you're going to have a better ability to compete for those contracts. And obviously, there's a lot of things getting into that. But if you get one, the SLAs are very stringent. So again, you need a high reliability. You need to be able to address the service needs of that specific customer without impacting the rest of your traffic at the same time. So really fascinating stuff. I think we're going to see more of it. The statement seemed to bear it out. And so I think we're going to see more of this as we go forward, and we'll see exactly how much speed they can eventually kind of squeeze out of this, especially for rural areas.
Just to add, I think what I've heard is, or read is, the rule of thumb for, where these access fit. Fiber will always be the best, but when you start getting very, very low density areas, and we're talking about, and I think the rule of thumb I've seen is kind of 6 homes per mile passed. Anytime you're getting less than that, that's where some of these other technologies like fixed wireless and LEO are more cost effective, and that's why there's a role for all of them to play. There's no question. Fiber is just, in some places, are just going to be too expensive, and that's why service providers need all the tools in the toolkit. But the key message, as we'll talk later, you need a technology agnostic middle mile that can handle any of them, right? You don't want to tie yourself just to fiber. You want to keep the door open. You don't want to have to get a separate middle mile just for fixed wireless. You want a technology agnostic one. So
I think that's a really important point, Mitch. And just to kind of reiterate what you're saying, I've seen two different attitudes towards this. One is like, we're going to compete like, you know what, and we don't want to touch those guys, and I get that. But the other one is, I'm going to compete like crazy, but I'm going to be at the table every time, figuring out how I get my piece of the pie, no matter what happens. And I think it's that latter one, being open to, hey, maybe this isn't this isn't the perfect thing, but this is the way I've got a path forward. And if I have a strong middle mile and I have the ability to sit at the table and have those conversations, I create more optionality for myself. Optionality equals value.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So, all right.
Yeah. So on BEAD, I mean, you mentioned this, and I think probably everybody who is looking at this has already read through the BEAD rules and things, but just to kind of hit the highlights again for everybody. The prior rules that were issued by the NTIA really had a fiber preference. It was very obvious. And in fact, when you look at some data, I found for percentage of locations covered by different technologies for Louisiana and Nevada, because they were basically out of the gates, they were ready to go. You could see the amount of fiber, and even Nevada, which was is a much more kind of the square state west of the Mississippi, open areas, there's still a lot of fiber. There's a lot of preference. Well, obviously, since that time, with this new set of guidance that came out, it went to technology neutrality, and you have this benefit of the bargain round. So basically, all awards were rescinded. Everybody has to recompete in this one round. The states are running those. As I said, they've either run them or they're in the process of running them. They're going to be completed very quickly because the states have to have everything back to the NTIA by September 4th. So something that they were spending years pulling stuff together is now done in 3 months. So these are very short windows that are going through that. The gating requirement point that I made here is, and this has been a point that's been picked up by a lot of very smart people that I trust when it comes to this, is that according to the statute, the states have the flexibility to determine what defines a priority broadband project, including its scalability to support higher speed services over time. That's where fiber has a strong preference. And I think a lot of people are hoping that that's what we're going to see. The only thing I caution people is it's 3 months. The states don't have a ton of time to go through this and to get all of these things lined up. So we could see definitely more fixed wireless and LEO solutions going forward. And going back to what we just said, if that happens, again, I want to be at the table, and I want to make sure that I have a network capability that I can provide the cell tower access, the fixed wireless tower access, that if there's LEO ground stations, that I have the ability to connect those so that I have a place to play in this whole thing as we go through. But there's a lot of questions around BEAD, and I think we'll see where this ultimately falls out. Probably within the next month, we're really going to see what the results are going to be.
I found this chart really revealing in the sense that everyone's kind of knows that, again, fixed wireless, LEO are going to play a role here, but it shows that really fiber is the ultimate winner. Still, according to this, at least in Nevada, maintaining 80%. I think it's going to matter by the state. A state like Nevada's got pretty a lot of probably low density areas, so that's where LEO and fixed wireless will play maybe a little bit bigger role, but still just 20% of the market. So I think hopefully at the end of the day, people recognizing the long term fiber is still going to be the best investment to go forward, but that both LEO and fixed wireless absolutely play a role.
I think one of the things that's really going to come out of this is if we see more fiber going forward, it's going to be for one of two reasons, and probably a combination of both. Number one, the states are heavily enforcing that priority broadband definition. So they're going to basically create sort of that preference set. But I think the second thing is we were probably going to have to see fiber providers putting in higher matches in dollars that are going to help them drive below that low cost threshold, so that they're competitive within the boundaries that are set by BEAD. But again, at the end of the day, this is going to be over. And then when you get to the other side of this, that's the landscape. So if you have a strong network, including your middle mile network, and you have a willingness to go in and find out, how do I get my piece of the pie? You're going to be in a better position going forward into that new sort of environment.
Exactly. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So this is one, I'm actually publishing a newsletter on this one just because I found this really fascinating. And this has started to come up. And here's the thing, folks. Like when I talk to folks at large operators, major tier 1 nationals, or I talk to rural broadband, this issue is coming up unprompted. So it's on their mind. And so I did a little bit of looking, and I make no claim that I did all of the math exactly right, especially in the first quarter of 25. I did on the others, I feel pretty good about, but found some data from OpenVault and Ericsson's forecast. And what I'm looking at here is, what is the monthly consumption per user, and comparing that over time. And what you're seeing is that growth curve, it's still positive. People are still consuming more, but we're starting to see a level of decline over time. And this is what I'm hearing from folks. Everybody's saying, hey, we're seeing growth, but we're seeing growth in, high single digits, mid single digits, whereas we hadn't seen that before. And when you step back for a second, it makes total sense, right? Because when we saw COVID, if you looked at some of the forecasts before and after COVID, COVID effectively accelerated forecasts like 18 months to 2 years in many instances in terms of the demand forecasts, because we were at home and the work from home requirements and everybody's consuming at the same time, et cetera. But at the same time, I just talked about $56 billion, as well as all of the focus from the large carriers in building networks. So we've had a large number of builds. We've had a lot of money thrown at this. We've talked about video and streaming. The networks have gotten better and better at handling those. Obviously, we still have, we have more coming. But the question is there something big and meaningful that's going to change the game going forward? AI is the one everybody's talking about. And Mitch, I know you're going to talk about some of that from the data center side here in a moment. But I think that the thing is a lot of folks are seeing this. And when you look at all this, you realize your middle mile, even when I see a growth curve, I can separate a growth curve into different services and segments. And there will be growth in specific areas. I need the ability to support growth in those specific services, so I can continue to drive demand and I continue to drive utilization levels on my network, so I create the kind of margins that I'm hoping to get. That's where your middle mile is going to come into play again. Again, this ability to provide different services based upon where the demand is actually going.
I find that curve, the monthly home broadband consumption, I think that's going to continue to go up, because I think we're still at the cusp of people streaming, cord cutting, shifting their viewing to more streaming, watching these one-time events. So it's going to be interesting to see. I think, go over like a terabit of bandwidth, and I think that's the type of thing our customers have to be aware of to be ready.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. And I would agree with you, Mitch, because I think, that's fundamentally the question I have is, people are raising this issue, and is it a blip? Is it, and it is sort of this calm before the storm? Because I think that once AI takes off, it's going to move quickly. And the other risk people have is, think about when you're building networks, you normally build off your forecast. If you start building your forecast based upon declining, or not declining demand, but basically a slower growth, and then suddenly it shoots up, you're behind the 8 ball and you've missed this. So I think it's really something that's important. I agree with you. I think people are going to continue to grow consumption as we go forward. And I think it'll be really interesting to see how AI starts to affect this picture.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Perfect.
And then, so fiber competition. Let's just talk about fiber competition, and especially in rural. So on the left side, found this great data from NRTC. a survey they did amongst their membership, and you can see 60% of the membership is seeing higher degrees of competition. In fact, almost everybody, 90%, have seen increased competition in the last 3 years. I suspect everybody who's on this call or in this webinar already knows this information, because when I talk to operators on the ground, they are seeing competition from every single direction. I'm seeing the big guys are doing overbuilds, like they're upgrading. I've got some cable providers who are going in and starting to build out fiber. I normally have fiber overbuilders. I've got normally 1 or 2 fixed wireless companies in there. Now I've got Starlink. There's some areas where you're seeing 7, 8, 9 competitors in an area that is primarily rural. It's crazy. It's absolutely crazy. So one of the tactics that's coming out of this is the ability to differentiate yourself by being able to provide higher speed services to customers. Now, customers on average don't really use all of that bandwidth. However, you have to have the ability to deliver on it in order to stay in that game. So whether or not you say I'm going to do it or not, you have to have it. It's becoming table stakes capability in order to deliver. And so if you're going to actually have that, you've got to, you do not have a multi-gig offer if your middle mile network does not support that level, as Mitch talked about earlier from the example that, the case study that he went through earlier. So this is one of the big things that we're seeing. And I see a lot of people who are saying, how do I compete against all of this? And this is the last one that I'm going to go through. But really, simple thing is, if you take data from US Telecom, who does a great pricing study, and you look at it, and what they do is they say, okay, I bucket things into different packages. I've got a consumer choice, which is about 25 to 100 megabit per second package, or speed, which is 100 to 940. And they do this study of the FCC urban rates. And what they do is say, okay, what is the typical package that people are purchasing? And what is the average monthly cost that they're paying for that? And I've just taken one step and I've normalized that. And I just take that monthly rate and I divide it by the megabits per second, so I can see what's the dollar per megabit per second. And you see some interesting effects. And you see that really prior to COVID, everything was on a decline. That's normal. I expect to see that. But what you see is in COVID, especially in that consumer choice, that lower end product, huge amounts of demand for it. We're seeing people moving into higher speeds. We're starting to upgrade because, hey, I need more at home. And you have what I call the ACP effect, where with the Affordable Connectivity Program, people wanted lower cost options available, and that drove it down. And the net is we're starting to drive to almost consolidating or converging the pricing, even with those higher speed products as we go forward. Folks, I look at this, and when I talk to people in the industry, this is probably one of the biggest issues that they're dealing with. And so it's critically important that your network is an asset, a strategic asset for you, in your ability to generate new revenues, to drive efficiencies, and operate at a lower cost so you can sustain margins in the face of competition and customer demands. That's it, plain and simple. And that's really where your middle mile comes into play.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Terry. So I'm going to kind of take us to the end here, talk about a topic that I think is top of mind for many of us. I don't think anyone can read any kind of news these days and not hear the topic about AI. And then there's the opportunity really to interconnect those data centers. So I'm going to explain it a little bit and then talk about some of the I think really great opportunities for our customers in the rural markets. First thing, just to clarify, because not everyone may be familiar with the terms, is really the kind of two main roles of how AI is delivered, right? And so the first model is what's called training. So you need to basically train the model. So I don't know. I'm sure everyone's kind of heard about kind of what AI is about. AI is about basically understanding patterns in data. And the more data you have, the better you can train the model to do that, right? So the example here is an example of like training it to understand images. You train it and you'll hear the term label data, right? So you have a picture of a strawberry, you label it a strawberry, a picture of a bicycle, and a picture of a person. And so really the goal in the training mode is to take all that data, typically from an enterprise, and feed it into usually a core data center, which basically goes through the process of training and teaching it to say, well, next time I see that image of a strawberry, that's what I'm going to say it is, right? And so usually the training process means lots and lots of data is fed into these core data centers to create the model. Now, that tends to be more of an infrequent, like once you train the model, you may go back and update it, but it usually means a lot of data for a short period of time to train the model. But once the model has been trained, then there's all of us who use the model. And that's where, you go to ChatGPT and you ask it a question. And that's referred to as inference. Inference is now, in this example, you show a picture of a bicycle and it goes to the AI model and it basically trains to say, okay, that is a bicycle. And I think I don't know if you've used kind of Google Lens or whatever, there's applications like that where you take a picture of something and it's going to come back and tell you what it is. Like I'm big in gardening, so I very often I spot a plant that I'm interested in, and you can take a picture of a plant and it's going to go in its database and be able to tell you, oh, that's a hydrangeum of that type. That's an example of doing that. So inference, we're going to see a lot more inference being done versus training. And that tends to have to be done closer to the user to get the best performance, right? Because we can't afford to all go back to that core data center. If everyone's going to be doing these applications. So you're going to see more data centers located closer to you. And in fact, we've actually told many of our rural customers that, in fact, much of the space that you're freeing up, I know many of you are modernizing your voice networks or modernizing your networks. You're freeing up lots of space in your central offices. In fact, to do inference, that's actually the perfect application to do in your central offices with the space, that you're freeing up. Now, where will these edge data centers be deployed? Well, again, we're starting to see a prevalence of doing this in rural locations. Traditionally, data centers were built in kind of where these black dots are, the main hubs being, Northern Virginia, Chicago, Dallas, Phoenix, Northwest and Northern California. But now what's happening is there's no longer space and certainly power to build out these, huge data centers. AI actually consumes a lot more power than a traditional data center. So now we're starting to see the emergence of new data centers being built very much, and it could be around the periphery, around a major metro. So I'm here based in Atlanta. We're actually seeing a ton of new data centers built, maybe 100 miles, up to 150 miles away from downtown Atlanta. But in all these examples, you still need to connect back to those main hubs. And that's where there's a need for very high-speed connectivity to enable that. So a lot of cases, the inference may be done at these locations. Even the training could be done if it's, delivering cheaper real estate and power. So, really great opportunity in the real market because this is where the growth is. So who are the players for this? Well, traditionally, the hyperscalers, which are the Googles and Facebooks and Microsofts, they start from the core and now are slowly moving to the edge because they recognize the need to have these infrastructure closer to the users. Data center operators, which are folks like Digital Realty as an example, or Equinix, they've kind of been in that middle, starting the edge and closer. And then there's folks like yourself as service providers. And this is where I view this as you're sitting on this very valuable, what I call AI beachfront real estate, meaning you have space and power closer to the user, whether it's a business, residential, or mobile user. And this is where things like inference are going to get done. So the training, again, more at the core, and inference, the industry needs much more of this compute power locally. So this is where the hyperscalers need that. They don't want to go build this themselves. And so that's why I think you're really sitting on a really good opportunity. And finally, just to give you an example of the applications, this was with a service provider here in Georgia. They built a data center, again, about 65 miles kind of east of Atlanta, but they needed to connect back to the central cloud exchange in downtown Atlanta. And they went out and they built their own, they got their own fiber, so that's pretty common. But then they were looking for a protection link, and they wanted that over diverse fiber. They obviously didn't want to follow the same fiber path as the main path for survivability. And then this is where this service provider stepped in, had a lot of rural fiber, was able to create a diverse protection link. In this case, it was 100 gig managed service that they offered to make this connectivity. And so we see a great opportunity for this. So, many of the customers that may have built that primary link probably aren't aware, many of you, if you're sitting on this rural fiber footprint, it's an opportunity for you to go out and position this as a protection link. And certainly we're out talking to many of our customers to position this. And if you want to learn more, there's a case study, there's a link to do this. So we've kind of covered a lot of ground in this webinar, and we wanted to kind of summarize this as kind of the, what's the requirements, because this is kind of set the stage for the future webinars in this series, right? So we wanted to kind of say on the left, what are the market drivers, the ones that Terry and I covered, and then what does that mean for you in terms of considering middle mile? So if I start on the left, the B changes, the fact that we talked about the fact now they changed the rules, they're making it much more technology agnostic, bringing in LEO and fixed wireless. And really the message for you when you're building a middle mile is you really want a technology last mile agnostic middle mile that can support fiber or fixed wireless, or even connecting to the ground stations for LEO is another opportunity. So don't tie your middle mile just to last mile. Keep your options open by having a technology agnostic middle mile. We talked about the growth in streaming and real-time content. We talked about the example of a customer realizing, if I really, really want to double down on that, I'm going to need a scalable network. I need a middle mile that can support 400 gig to handle some of those major streaming events like the Super Bowl or the Thursday night prime football, which sounds to be, becoming the new kind of Mother's Day, right? Growth of broadband speed and competition. Terry touched on this, that pretty much everyone's kind of re-looking at this 1 gig broadband speed as a way to differentiate the competition, creating that as a new benchmark. So again, is your middle mile ready to handle that? We need to be able to support a mix of residential and business services. There's lots of different services out there. Residential is great, but there's a lot of other business applications that are actually more profitable. And so you need a service aware middle mile that can support all those different services and not impact the performance of any one. And finally, we talked about AI, right? And this, again, a great opportunity for many of our rural customers. And so you really want to be ready. You want a middle mile that can scale. And again, we're talking about having connectivity, typically 400 gig is becoming the new kind of currency for data center interconnect to connect to these data centers. So you need a really scalable middle mile to support that. So we hope this is helpful, because it's going to set the stage as we go into our future webinars. Anything else to add here, Terry?
No, I think that's really you covered a lot of it. Thank you, Mitch. I think this is really good.
Perfect. So we hope you enjoyed today's webinar. Like I said, it's just the first in a series of 4. So the next one we're going to have is on Wednesday, August 6th, and you're going to have, and I'm sure many of you met Jeff Wilson, who heads our SysEng team, and Drew Nelson, who's one of our top architects who works with many of you. They're going to kind of take that previous chart we did and kind of talk about, okay, well, these are the requirements. Well, how do I deliver? What's the architecture for building a middle mile to meet those requirements. So please, if you haven't registered for that, please register for that. It's going to be a really good session. Get a little bit deeper into the technology. The next session after that, we'll talk about management and automation. And then finally, Terry and I are going to come back and close this out with a session on how to monetize once you've built these great networks. How to maximize your revenue. So that's pretty much it. We're going to cover today. And I know we've almost come to the top of the hour, but I don't know, Lance, any questions you saw for the Q&A?
Yeah, thanks, Mitch. Thanks, Terry. Quite a few questions came in from the audience. We can just try to cover a few, and you can view those yourself there. If you look at the questions tab, you can see some of those if you want to quickly answer any of those. But a few came from the sort of the federal space, talking about tariffs, right? So how are these tariffs impacting equipment in terms of pricing or deployments or delivery?
I can give my perspective, Terry. Maybe you could add based on what you're saying. I mean, so far, I think it's still early days. I mean, everyone's still trying to figure out what the impact of tariffs. Unfortunately, every day the story changes. So, even if we give you an answer today, can we say it's going to be the same tomorrow? But so far, we haven't seen any huge impacts from it. But again, we're staying tuned and hopefully, I know, there's many deals being negotiated with multiple countries. So the hope is a lot of this will get kind of resolved perhaps in the next month. And, the hope is it's not going to really impact so much, what we're doing in this market.
Yeah, I think that's fair. It's been so early and there's been so much back and forth about the tariffs that I think many people are still trying to figure out what is true ground truth going to look like. And so, yeah, I think I would agree with you.
Yeah, exactly.
Great. One other one on the federal space and is about BEAD. So do you think all that BEAD money is going to be awarded with the new rules? Any surplus?
That's a great question. If you look at it, if you're now going to award lowest cost, in theory, you're going to see lower, grant amounts going out for a set amount of areas. And I know certainly here in Texas, where I'm based, they've already talked about potentially giving back $1 billion to BEAD. So I do think the majority of it, the vast majority gets awarded, but I think it's very, there is definitely a non-zero chance that a portion of it gets held back.
Great.
Yeah.
I had a question on 400G. If 400G is needed for aggregation, what are your views on 100ZR as a viable pluggable? Is it obsolete?
I guess it depends, obviously, on application. I think 100ZR is definitely going to play a role. For you still want to kind of have coherent optics, but that lower speed. I think like I said, it depends. Maybe for some small data centers with only a couple of racks of equipment that you don't need 400G, that could play in. Again, it depends on the economics. What we're seeing is, and I've seen this many times over my career, it's not just the first 100G. It's do you need the second one? Once you start needing the second one, then the economics of 400G becomes much more attractive, right? So it depends. If you're only starting at 50G and you think 100G can last you a long time, that's probably fine. But if you go over 100G, and start consuming that, then you'll see it doesn't take a whole lot to come up to 400G. So I think there'll definitely be a role for it. I mean, it's definitely being standardized in the industry. I guess we'll just have to see how it all shakes out.
Excellent. Let's see here. Is there any data on correlation between broadband speed offered and bandwidth consumed? For example, like if a customer that is upgraded from 500 meg to 1 gig equate to more content consumed by that consumer?
Yeah, I can take that. I mean, I've seen studies around that. and some behavior. What I'd say is the drivers of consumption are not always, and they're sometimes moving them to a higher tier. It's more about what they're consuming it for. So think about your customer base as a set of segments. If they tend to be in a segment that would tend to consume more, by moving them to a higher speed, they will consume more. If they were somebody who is not in that, by moving them up, you basically will get a little bit of growth, but you won't get a tremendous amount over time. However, sometimes people, when they get upgraded speeds, they see other benefits, whether it's just better latency or something else. And so they equate that as value, even though it's not really to do with the speed. It's something else that's in the offer.
Yeah. It's interesting, that example I gave of the Georgia service provider, that experiment they did, really interesting. They upgraded all their customers to 1 gig, and they didn't tell them. So I don't know if I mentioned that. They didn't tell them they're doing that. So I think basically what it said is their performance increased, right? Because, at the lower speed, perhaps they couldn't stream as much 4K, or they couldn't do other services. And when they were all upgraded to the higher speed, they just, because the performance was better, they were consuming more. So it's interesting. That's a real life example of kind of what the service provider, did experience doing that. So I think the higher speeds, it just, and some people perceive higher speed as just better performance, right? And even for a lower speed application, like a gaming application. So it's kind of interesting, but I think we'll hear more and more as more service providers do that.
Okay, well, we actually have a few more questions, but I think just in the interest of time, we'll address those offline and respond to all those. So thank you for your questions, and sorry we couldn't get to them all in the recording. We're a little bit over an hour now, but I did want to thank you, Terry, and thank you, Mitch, for your time today, as well as the audience. Obviously, we appreciate you joining us today. As Mitch mentioned, plenty more content to come in this series. And later on this afternoon, please look for an email from us with a link to the replay, as well as a copy of the slides from today's presentation. You can always respond to that with additional questions. And if you did ask a question today and didn't get that answered verbally, rest assured we will be following up with you to get that question answered. So once again, thank you all for joining, and we really appreciate you being on with us today. Look forward to seeing you on the next one. Take care and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks.